Recording in progress.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just gotta put the camera on.
Is it anywhere we want? Is it
No.
anywhere you want?
You can't. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Boker tov. Shabbat tov, everybody. I'm back. I'm back for the past present. Is our X is the X.
His future is behind him.
Yes. All right. So we concluded last week with our discussion regarding primary themes of the Zahor at Yom Shabbat, and now we move on today to Shamor at Yom Shabbat in terms of the negative mitzvot prohibitions. Today's show is going to be a little bit different. The topic today is more general, looking at general principles and introductions. The Shir is called Mavor Melachot Shabbat, in other words, introduction to the Melachot of Shabbat. We can't get through everything, but there's an entire framework in terms of the ideas of Melechet Machshevet. I'm sure people have heard of Psik Reisha, Malacha Sheinat Shechal Gufa, lots of the terms that get thrown around when it comes to Melachot Shabbat. We could spend months analyzing each one. We're not going to do that, but we're going to give a quick overview of some of the terms, some of the references, some of the ideas and concepts which are going to be very, very important moving forward. Without this, it's impossible to begin any serious study of Hilchot Shabbat. So let's begin on page 245 with the introduction. Here we have from the introduction of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah, as you know, was written by the Chafetz Chaim. We have the Shulchan Aruch. When Rav Yosef Karo writes the Shulchan Aruch, more or less 500 years ago, so he bases himself on the Tur. The Tur is the son of the Rosh, who was the first one to reorder. The first one, the Rambam did as well, in a sense. But until that point, so we have the Gemara, we have throughout Shas, all the different halachot are scattered all over the place. It's very, very difficult to find the things that you need if you want an orderly sort of presentation of halakha, what's called the first of the codes. The Rambam did that as well, and the Tur, who's the son of the Rosh, does that. He writes it Arba Turim, right? 4 different sections, Orach Chaim, Yoredeya, Even HaEzer, Choshen Mishpat. The Maran Beit Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes his commentary on the Tur, which is the Beit Yosef, and then he summarizes himself in what's called the Shulchan Aruch. And since then, that is the basic code of Jewish law that we go by. The Mishnah Berurah is written by the Chafetz Chaim 120 years ago or so, and that is just on the section of Orach Chaim, just in the section of Orach Chaim, which is the laws of daily life. It's going through from the time we wake up in the morning, Tefillah, Kriyat Shema, Tefillin, Tzitzit, etc., going through Hilchot Shabbat, Hilchot Yom Tov, etc. So we have 6 volumes of the Mishnah Berurah covering Orach Chaim. Chelek Gimel, which is the 3rd section, is entirely devoted to Hilchot Shabbat. So in the introduction to Chelek Gimel, the Mishnah Berurah, which, as we said, is the Chafetz Chaim, writes an introduction, and he says as follows. It's in source number 1. He says, Zchut Shmirat Shabbat Kehalacha Mo'ilim Chol HaKol Avonotav. First of all, you have to know how much Chazal praise the idea of keeping Shabbat and keeping Shabbat properly. What it does, it says that in the merit of somebody who observes Shabbat will be forgiven for all of one's sins. It doesn't mean that you can go out and do whatever you want and sin all week long and then say I'm keeping Shabbat. It's okay. Obviously, that's not the intent. But in any event, Ashrei Enosh Yaseh Zot u'Ben Adam Yachzik Ba Shomer Shabbat Mechalalo v'Shomer Yado Me'asot Kol Ra. That is the pasuk in Yeshayahu. Now, he says, "Be'ez inyan nochal lavo lazor madrega she'yishmor Shabbat b'chol pratav." So a person thinks, okay, this is wonderful, we'll keep Shabbat, and that's not so easy, says the Chafetz Chaim, to get to the madrega, to get to the level of a Shomer Shabbat. Why? He says, "Itza yutza lezeh." Now we're in bold. שיראה לזרז את עצמו ללמוד הלכות שבת ולחזור עליה תמיד כדי שאינה אסור ומותר. A person needs to study Hilchot Shabbat, and a person needs to do Chazara. You need to go back and you need to do revision and to know what is forbidden and what is permitted. It says if you don't study Hilchot Shabbat, you will not, by definition, you will not be able to reach the level of a Shomer Shabbat. Because if you don't, אפילו אם יעמוד כל העניינים המוסריים ומזלזים לשמת שבת כראוי לא יועילו. You'll learn all about the Musar, how important it is to keep Shabbat, etc. That's not going to help you. It's the Chafetz Chaim, by the way. This is from Sefer Mishnah Berurah. You know, Chafetz Chaim wrote many Svarim. So he wrote 2 very famous Svarim on Shmirat HaLashon. There's a Sefer Chafetz Chaim, where the name comes from. He wasn't actually called the Chafetz Chaim. That was the name of his sefer, and that became that's how it became known. But also wrote a sefer called Shmirat HaLashon. And those two svarim go hand in hand. One deals with the halachot of Lashon Hara, what is considered forbidden speech, what is permitted speech. One of the very important sections of Sefer Chafetz Chaim, which people don't always think about, and people don't always realize, but it's the section of when you are permitted, even required to speak Lashon Hara, when it's for toilet, when it's for constructive purposes, under certain situations. Right, and it can happen sometimes. A person wants to know, a person's inquiring about a shidduch, or a person's inquiring about a business partnership, whatever it may be, and you have information that's very important, but again, there are conditions. You don't have ulterior motives, you know it firsthand, it's accurate, etc. But you have information that you know this person's entering a disastrous situation. You have to tell them. You have to tell them. And therefore, so he has a whole book about what is permitted and what is forbidden, and how we know, and what we're allowed to say, what we're allowed to hear, etc. And then there's another sefer, which is telling us about how important it is to avoid Lashon Hara and guarding your speech and all the types of what he calls Inyanei HaMusar. And he says one book without the other is not helpful. If I write you just a book about the halachot, you don't realize how important it is, so you'll never study it, you'll never keep it. On the other hand, if you realize how important it is, but you don't know the halachot, so what good have we done? He says the same thing with Hilchot Shabbat. Person can sing all those mirot and can know how important Shabbat is, and, right? Can give hear a Mussar Shmuz every week about the importance of Shabbat. But if you don't know the details of Hilchot Borer and you don't know the details of Hilchot Bishul, you won't keep Shabbat because you just don't know. There is sometimes there are shiurim that are given. I saw somebody wrote an article. How many about? I don't remember the number, 10, 15, whatever it is, potential possible violations that a person can have of Shabbat just by sitting at the Shabbos table. Of Borer, of Bishul, all sorts of things. If you don't know what you're doing, then you can you can run into a lot of problems. So therefore he says, we'll skip to the second part in bold. So the person doesn't learn, doesn't study Hilchot Shabbat, and that's what we're doing here. But if you don't come to the Tzurba Rabbanan Shir and Hilchot Shabbat, so then you have problems. That's essentially that. That's not me. That's the Chafetz Chaim. Last paragraph. He says one of the things prevent people from being proficient in these laws. Says the Chafetz Chaim, again writing 120 years ago, or so maybe a little more. He says that nowadays you can't understand halakha unless you really understand. It's not enough just to see the Shulchan Aruch. You have to know the source of the din from the Gemara through the poskim. In other words, there you see he says it black and white twice. You have to learn. So Rabbanan, right? A person doesn't have time to go and to learn. We're so busy. We have all these things which are keeping us busy. So if that was true in the days of the Chafetz Chaim, how much more so is it true today? Over the page now. Not only that, on every detail we know there's machloket. There's the Shulchan Aruch says this way, and the Ramah says that way, and the Rambam says this, and the Rosh says this, and Rav Elyashiv says it's asur, and Rav Shlomo Zalman says it's mutar. Right? You have to know what's going on. That's related to learning halakha in general, and that I told you about in the Haktamat to Chelik Aleph. But now we're talking specifically about Hilchot Shabbat. He says, "Lezot kamti v'nitolati b'ezrat Hashem yibarach la'ava'er gam ha'chazor chamura kol din v'din b'ta'amo v'nimuko migmar poskim." And therefore, I'm going to teach you and I'm going to explain to you every single din from the Gemara through the poskim. I don't think there's a share here where we don't quote the Mishnah Berurah. But when you study the Mishnah Berurah in depth, you understand the genius of it. Really goes one line, which just tells you the bottom line conclusion. But through the Gemara, the Rishonim, the Achronim, and all the everything that goes into it, and every detail. I'll add that obviously nowadays there are all sorts of questions. When the Chafetz Chaim was writing this, he couldn't have imagined, electricity and motion sensors and smart homes and internet and all. Autonomous car, whatever you want, all sorts of things. Kadashim Karim every day. We have new questions coming in Hilchot Shabbat, and if we aren't proficient in the principles, right, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand the application, understand where these things apply. So that is why we have to build it up.
Step by step. Different opinions from different poskim. makes it very difficult.
Right. Of course, there are different opinions, there are different poskim, and especially when we're dealing with new technology, which is changing all the time. And that is why Chazal tell us in Pirkei Avot, right? Say Rav, the person has to know who to follow and how to do this. So he says, "Akaveh b'zat Hashem yipalach, shemi she'yamod ata halacha, yeda kol din v'ta'amo v'nimukol halacha l'manseh." I hope now everybody who studies this will know that's a unique. Very often in halacha Sfarim, you find even the most practical Sfarim, they write the introduction. Everything that's written here in the book is the halacha v'lo l'maaseh. This is just for study; it's not for practical. Chafetz Chaim tells you, I'm telling you the halacha and the mas. ראוי ונכון לכל ילד וחלק את דבר השם, לכונן חברות ללמוד הלכות שבת כדי שלא ייכשלו בהם. And people should establish study groups of the third time, Tzurba Rabbanan, to learn Hilchot Shabbat. Okay, so that is the introduction of the Chafetz Chaim. Hopefully that gives us the motivation. As I say, for the last few months, we've been studying Hilchot Shabbat, no less important, but the aspects of Zachor, in terms of Kiddush and Adlakat Nerot and the 3 meals and Havdalah and Tefillot, etc. Now we're getting really into the nitty-gritty of the details of the 39 Melachot. And as I said, today we won't get so much into the practical applications, but we're looking more at the principles, more at the foundations, more how we look at it. We will have Bezrat Hashem in future volumes specific shirim dedicated to electricity and all those kinds of questions as well. But for now, let's begin with the introduction. So page 247. We have the first thing to know, right? Whenever we're talking about Hilchot Shabbat, the things that you cannot do. So we have 39 categories of melachot, 39 forbidden labors, say 39 categories, because in each of those we have what's called avot and toladot. Avot meaning essentially the main principle, and the tolada, which is maybe the primary category, and the tolada, which is the derivative. What is the difference between an av and a tolada? We'll see. This is a concept, by the way, we have throughout the Torah. It's not just when it comes to Shabbat. For example, the Gemara Bava Kama, first Mishnah, av avot nazikin. There are 4 primary categories of damages, and then the Gemara there discusses you have avot and you have toladot. Right, so same idea here. The Rambam in the first halacha in Hilchot Shabbat, Rambam source number 2 on page 247, says Shvita b'shvi mi melacha mitzvat aseh. So very interesting. The first thing you should know is that rest on the 7th day. I've been harping on every single share. We have Zahor and we have Shamor. We have the positive and we have the negative. Right? The Rambam tells us that the negative is also a positive. That the fact that refraining from melacha is not just something you can't do, but something you do. You rest from these actions. He says, Shvita b'shvi mi melacha mitzvat aseh. This is a positive command. Shene'emar ubayom hashvi tishbot. That you shall rest on the 7th day, right on Shabbat. V'chol ha'oseh bo melacha b'tel mitzvat aseh ve'ava lo taseh. Shene'emar lo taseh kol melacha. So it is both. Not performing melacha is the fulfillment of both a positive and a negative command. Okay, the fact that it's a positive as well, so you might have thought that women would be exempt, since we are dealing with a mitzvat aseh, a positive command, and it's certainly a time-bound command. So you have the Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin, which talks about these matters. Source number 3, it says, Kol mitzvah lo taseh, ben shazman grama, ben shelo zman grama, echad hanashim ve'echad hanashim chayavin. Right? When it comes to negative commandments, the Mishnah tells us that whether they are time-bound or not time-bound, men and women are equally obligated in them, with the exception of Bal Takif, Bal Tashchit, or Bal Tamei Lameitim. Okay, certain things regarding haircuts and beards and Tumat Met. But otherwise, women are equally obligated as men. The Gemara here derives it from Pasuk as well. But therefore, that is when it comes to Shabbat, there's no question that women would be obligated in these refraining from these melachot. Sefer HaChinuch, source number 4, says Lo la'asot melacha b'yom HaShabbat noeget b'kol makom b'kol zman b'zcharim u'v'nkev. This applies. The Sefer HaChinuch, again, which is a sefer we don't know conclusively who wrote it. It's thought to be that it was the author was learning with his son, going through the 613 mitzvot with bar mitzvah. So this was written as sort of a guidebook and workbook for it with bar mitzvah. You can see nowadays we study it a little bit later on in life as well. But with every mitzvah, he introduces and he tells you, does this mitzvah in which time it applies, which location it applies. Certain things don't apply outside the Beit HaMikdash. Certain things don't apply b'zman hazeh. Again, Shabbat, just so there should be no misconceptions. It's related to the Mishkan, etc. But nonetheless, Shabbat applies at all times, in all places, for men and women equally. So we have in source number 5, we have the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat, Perek Zayin, which tells us, lists the 39 melachot. Okay, notice how it says avot melachot. Right, the primary categories of melachot are 40 chasar achat, 40 minus 1, i.e. 39, and the Mishnah has a certain way of grouping them: zoreh, choresh, kotzer, ma'amer, dash, zoreh, etc. Okay, the first group are those which are related to what's called sidurat depat. That in the Mishkan, when you had the lechem and panim, all those melachot which are necessary in terms of preparing the bread, that is the first group, and we have different ways which the melachot are grouped. Okay, we won't go through all 39, but there you have the list in Hebrew and in English. And the Mishnah concludes, it says, Hareilu avot melachot abim chasar. Again, so these are the avot melachot. Now, from the fact that they are called avot, that these are called the primary categories, we understand that there are toladot, which are subcategories. Again, let's not get confused here. Right now, everything we're talking about is on a d'oraita level. These are still biblically commanded. We're going to see later on that there are also mitzvot d'Rabbanan, or Gezerot Rabbanan, which are added on Shabbat, and this is going to be it's very, very important to understand the difference between a Doraita and a Rabbanan, and also many practical ramifications. For example, person is sick or something where not pikuach nefesh, but there are going to be much greater leniencies to perform something which is the Rabbanan than it is the Doraita, if it's necessary, right? Barring extenuating circumstances, we're not allowed to perform neither the Doraita nor the Rabbanan. But when we talk about avot and toladot, sometimes people get confused. Sometimes people think avot means doraita and toladot means rabbanan. That is not correct. Avot and toladot are both doraita. We have not yet gotten to the rabbanan. So the Gemara Bava Kama, right at the beginning, because over there the Mishnah talks about avot and nezikin, so it gets onto a discussion of avot and toladot in general and also related to Shabbat. So it says, right, Gabei Shabbat nan avot melachot abim chazar achat. Avot Miklal the toladot. The Mishnah doesn't list all the toladot. It would be very, very long if it did. But it says from the fact that it lists avot, you can infer there are also toladot. So it says toldotehen kayotze bahen lo shna av chatat velo shna tolada chatat. The din of one who had performed a tolada would be exactly the same as one who had performed an av in the sense. So both would be chayav chatat, or in a case where you'd be chayav skila, that would be the same for both, depending on whether it's mezid or shogeg, etc. So says the Gemara, ma'ika ben avra tolada. If that's the case, why do I care? What's the difference between whether it's an av or a tolada? So the nafkamina is the ilu avid shtei avot b'hadei adadi. If you perform two, one after the other, it's b'hadei adadi. It's translated as during a single lapse of awareness, right? In other words, let's say when a person performs something, we say b'shogeg. Shogeg means either I didn't know that it was Shabbat today, or I didn't know that it was that the specific action I'm performing is forbidden. Right? So a person's whatever wakes up whatever it is, their alarm. I forgot to set their alarm for before Shabbat. Let's just say, so it's going on all week. So you wake up at whatever time, you're still half asleep. You get up, or you're asleep in the morning. You walk out the apartment and you press the button for the elevator, right? And you think, oh, it's Shabbat. Okay. Then on your way home, you're half asleep again, and then you press the button again. So in between, you realize that it was Shabbat. So that's not in one go. That's considered in two different lapses. But if I woke up and I boiled the kettle and I made some coffee and then I turned the lights on or whatever, and then I realized it was Shabbat. Okay, so that all those things were done in one lapse. So it says like this: if you performed ilu avid shtei avot b'hadei adadi, you performed two different avot melacha in one go, right? Light a fire and I'm cooking, whatever it is. Or alternatively, shtei toladot b'hadei adadi, or two different toladot of different melachot. I perform them together. So then, mechayev hakol chada v'chada. How many times would I be liable to bring a korban? How many times would I be liable for that? So in that case, for each one would be a separate chatat. But if you performed an av and a toladah together, then that would only be because it's the same category, in the same lapse.
No, but it's on Tolada, not like an Avon and Tolada of the same
Right.
malacha.
An Av and a Tolada of the same malacha.
Right.
So that would be then one only five once. Okay, so that is essentially the nafkamina between avot and toladot. What is a tolada? So the Rambam over here in the Perush Mishnayot explains. He says that tolada הוא שתחשוב בלבך על תוצאות פעולת אותה מלאכה המנויה באבות. You think about the results of the action of that מלאכה. וכל מקום שתמצא אותה פעולה זהו תולדה לאותו העם. So you're going to find a different action, but that's going to bring about the same result. The way he writes it, yes, it's going to be the same action. That is going to be a tolada. So let's see some of the examples. It gives it easier to understand. We see the examples. One of the primary categories of melachot is tochen, which is grinding. So what is grinding, right? Very often the learning about the avot and the toladot more than necessarily any practical nafkamina that comes out of it, but it helps us to sharpen the definition of each category. Helps us to sharpen the definition of what the malacha is, and then we can understand whether specific actions fit into the malacha or not. So he says, "Inyan tochen utchinat chelek gadol v'fichato chalakim ktanim." What is grinding? Grinding is you take a large object and you grind it up, you turn it into much smaller pieces, and therefore lefichach chituch yirakot b'Shabbat. A person is going to chop up vegetables on Shabbat, right? You're cutting up for salad, for Israeli salad. Okay, that is not. Without now getting into, we'll have a separate shir on tochen, how large, how small, can you cut up the vegetables, when, etc. I'm not getting into that now. But the point is, if you cut up the vegetables very small, whatever that is, that would be a tolada of tochen. You're not grinding, therefore it's not the av, but you're doing the same action, which is taking a larger object and transforming it into much smaller pieces. Or you're cutting wood in order to get it sawdust. Or shifat matechen לקחת לנוסורת שלה. Now you're shaving metal to take its dust. Or bikua etzim lasaka. You're splitting up wood for firewood. All of these is a tolada of tochen. When it comes to bishul, we're going to have many shirim on bishul, don't worry. But the Rambam's definition of bishul is to soften a hard object. And therefore, he says, if you're melting metal, that is also going to be a tolada of ofer. Ofer and bishul, cooking and baking, is actually the same melacha, interchangeable words. We can discuss that another time as well. Okay, so that is the difference between avot and toladot. Again, very, very importantly, that toladot are just as much in isur d'oraita as the avot. But now we get into the category of d'Rabbanan. There are a number of different categories of d'Rabbanan. So first of all, we have the melachot, and then we have additional actions which are not included anywhere in the melachot, but Chachamim saw a reason to forbid those on Shabbat, and therefore those are going to be forbidden as well. One of the most famous Isurei d'Rabbanan on Shabbat that everybody knows is Muktzah. And it's funny, some of the things we've spoken in the past, how many people associate, what are the prohibitions of Shabbat? Many people will say to you, electricity. It's not clear that electricity in many applications, so there certainly are applications where this is not the case, but many applications of electricity, which may not be an isur d'oraita, may be only an isur d'Rabbanan, but nonetheless, that's how we think about it. I think often, for small kids as well, when you've got the word muktzah becomes interchangeable with something that you can't do on Shabbat. Kids ask me all the time, is it muktzah to run? That doesn't mean anything, right? Is it muktzah to do this? You can't say, I'll say this is how it's, that maybe shows you the wisdom of Chachamim, how certain things, safeguards which were implemented in order to prevent people from transgressing Shabbat. We come to view these things as that is Shabbat itself, muktzah. But muktzah really, what is it? We'll have a separate jury on muktzah, at least 3. That is where you have an object, different types of objects, for whatever reason, Chachamim said you cannot handle that object on Shabbat. But that is purely an isur d'Rabbanan, according to most. It's not one of the 39 melachot. Which of the 39 melachot is muktzah? There's none of them. It's d'Rabbanan. Okay, so that is one category. The Rambam says over here, source number 8. Again, the Rambam also conceptually, when he writes a Chot Shabbat, he lays out. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't really do this. The Shulchan Aruch goes through, and the Shulchan Aruch just explains to you the certain cases. What can you do here? What can't you do here? The order of the Shulchan Aruch as well follows the order of the Torah, which is a chronological order. So if you open up Hilchot Shabbat in the Torah of the Shulchan Aruch, it starts off with Hadlakat Nerot, Erev Shabbat, Tefillot Shabbat. It goes through Friday night. Then you get to leaving food which was cooked from before Shabbat, heating it up. You want to look at Hilchot Bishul, the Shulchan Aruch. You have to look in different places, because there's one place where he talks to me about the cooking that I can do on Friday afternoon, and there's another place he talks to me about the cooking I can do on Shabbat day. The Rambam works differently. The Rambam lists things conceptually. So he begins off with the introduction, the foundation, the fundamental principles behind Hilchot Shabbat, like we're doing now, and then he goes through the Avot, and he goes through the Toladot, and he goes through the Doraita, and he goes through the Rabbanan. It's a different structure, maybe one which is more familiar to the way that we order things. So he says, Kol makom shneimar b'Hilchot Shabbat, she'oseh davar ze chayav, harei ze chayav karet. Throughout the Gemara, Mishnah and the Gemara, we find certain actions on Shabbat. Often it doesn't say mutar or asur necessarily, but it uses a different language. It says chayav. So chayav means you are liable, means chayav karet, which is another way of saying that it's an isur deoraita. It's a biblical prohibition. If there are witnesses and warning, then it's a chayav skila, right? As much as this gets thrown around in the media from time to time, we're going to have a laughing stage, you're going to stone people who aren't keeping Shabbat. It's not so simple. There are lots of last year in the Masechet Makot, we saw in the Gemara here just how difficult it is for this to actually find its practical expression. And the truth is that the Torah probably doesn't want it to happen very often at all. But it's more to impress upon us the severity of what happens if one does not keep Shabbat. Okay, no one is advocating here that this should be in practical terms for people to be stoned in the streets. Make no mistake. But in any event, the point is that when it says chayav, that means it's isur d'oraita. Okay, for kol makom in halacha gimel, kol makom shene'emar, I should say ne'emar, she'oseh davar ze patur. Now the word patur means exempt. Normally we think of patur meaning exempt, meaning you can do it. But in Hilchot Shabbat, that's not the intention. Harei ze patur min hakaret u'min haskila min hakorban. Patur means you're exempt from the biblical punishment. Aval asur la'asot oto davar, but it's going to be forbidden to perform that action. B'Shabbat, v'isurom midivrei sofrim. Why is it forbidden? It's forbidden from it's rabbinic in nature. V'u'archaka min ha'melacha, in order to safeguard us against performing melacha. So that's very important, because we often see in the Mishnah and the Gemara, in the language of the Rishonim, certain action will say patur, and you would think, patur means mutar. No, patur does not mean mutar. Patur means that it is, unless stated explicitly otherwise, forbidden midrabanan. Over the page, we now get much later. You notice that was in Perek Aleph, and now you'll see we're quoting the Rambam in Perek Kaf Aleph, right? 20 chapters later, because he first discusses the Doraitas, and only then he discusses the Drabanan. So he says here, Ne'emar b'Torah tishbot, afilu midvarim she'enan melacha chayav lishbot. So when we say that, and this is the Rambam where we quoted before, to say it's a mitzvah aseh, where it says you should rest. And again, rest not in the sense of go and have sleep, but rest, I guess, more in the sense of desist, right? Desist from the activities. So he says there are also things which are not melacha, which we have to rest from. Dvarim arbehen she'asru chachamim shum shvut. Okay, this is another term, shvut. Shvut is a unique term to Shabbat, which is an isur d'Rabbanan, where Rabbanan said we can't do these things. Mehen dvarim asurim mipnei she'en domim lemelachot. So some of them because they resemble melachot. Umen dvarim asurim gezerah shemayavo men isur skila, because this action itself does not necessarily resemble a melacha, but Chachamim were concerned that if we allow A, you're going to come to do B, which is a not. Okay, so those are that's the reason why these things were introduced. I'll just say it's very interesting when the Rambam says here that the Torah says tishbot, and it says afilu midvarim she'enan melacha. So the Ramban is the most famous one who says this, but there are others as well who understand that there may be that if one does not fulfill the character, the nature of Shabbat, that it's possible to transgress Shabbat on a biblical level, even though the specific action that I've done is not a biblical malach. The Ramban gives the description about this, and this is one of the factors that comes in when we talk about electricity and technology and all sorts of things, that if you're going to just carry on doing things normally the way that you do during the week, and there is no recognizable difference, that may in itself, even though I can't point to any specific melacha, that may be a transgression of Shabbat, even on a biblical level. What sometimes people talk about, it's not in the spirit of Shabbat. It's not a fluffy concept. This is a real bona fide concept. Again, the challenge is when and how do we apply it, and what exactly are the borders. But we have many months of shirim ahead of us to talk about. Okay, so one category of Isurei D'Rabbanan of Shvut on Shabbat is whereby something in action like muktzah, it's not a melacha, but I'm worried, right, for Kli Shemalachto L'Isur, for example, an object, one of the categories of muktzah, which is actually the most lenient category, where an object which is normally used for a forbidden purpose, let's say a pen, is the example. A pen is a Kli Shemalachto L'Isur, because what do you do with a pen? You write. Writing is one of the lamatet melachot. So Rabbanan said the pen is a Kli Shemalachto L'Isur, which means don't move it, because I'm worried that it is moving the pen similar to a melacha. But I'm worried that if you move it, when it's in your hand, you'll remember what you have to do. You'll remember your shopping list for tomorrow, and you'll come to write it down. Okay? So therefore, you can't do it. So that is one category. All right?
Drawing, is that included in that?
Yes. It depends exactly how and when and what we're doing. But Roshem is also part of the could be part of the melacha of Kotef. We'll get to that when we get to that melacha. So that is the case. That is an example of an Isur D'Rabbanan, which is going to lead to an Isur D'Oraita. Now, there is also within the 39 melachot themselves. Here we get to the next concept. Within the 39 melachot, which the Torah listed, one is only going to be liable for those melachot if they are performed in a way that is called melechet machshet, which means considered constructive melacha. And there are a number of categories for something to be called a melechet machshet, but it has to be constructive, it has to be permanent, it has to be done in the usual fashion, it has to be done with intent, it has to be done directly. There are probably a few others which I've missed out. When certain, maybe some or all of those factors are missing, even though I've done that action, that then goes from the level of a D'Oraita down to a D'Rabbanan. Okay, so one example is, I said if it's not done in the typical fashion, it's called a shinun. We've all heard of the shinun. So we're talking about writing. Have a look at source number 10. The Mishnah over here says, and again, it's difficult because we don't have the way the Gemara is built up. We don't have anywhere in the Mishnayot and the Gemara, the Rambam we do. But in the Mishnot and the Gemara, it doesn't go and give us a definition. It doesn't start off and say, okay, these are the categories. These are the melachot. This is considered a shinoi. This is considered a... Right? It doesn't work that way. It just goes through the melachot. We're talking about writing. If you write with your right hand, if you write with your left hand, and we have to deduce from there. This is why through the generations there are different opinions, as we said before. There is Shonim, and Fronim, trying to understand and unpack what exactly is going on. So the Mishnah in source number 10 says, "Hakodev shtei otiyot." One who writes 2 letters. Again, I didn't mention another factor is there's a minimum for many of the melachot. There is a minimum amount on which it's or for which one is liable. If one does less than that, it's considered insignificant. Would not be liable on a D'Oraita level, only on a D'Rabbanan. So one who writes 2 letters, ben bimino ben mismono, whether it's with your right hand or your left hand. Ben mishum echad ben mishum echad mishtei shemot. Okay. In any event, the Chol Hashon says the Mishnah chayav, you are liable. So the Gemara says, I understand why, if you write with your right hand, you would be chayav. Mishum l'derech k'tiva b'kaf. That's the normal way of writing for most people. Ela ashmol amai. But if you're writing with your left hand, why then does the Mishnah say that it's chayav? Ha'en derech k'tiva b'kaf. That's not the normal way that most people write. Even though we saw last week, I think, that we have a high proportion of left-handers in the share. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah be'ter yad shan. Rabbi Yirmiyah says exactly, you're talking about somebody who's left-handed. In other words, when the Mishnah says ben bimino ben bismolo, means if you're right-handed, you'd be chayav if you write with your right hand, because that's your normal way of writing. And if you're left-handed, it's with your left hand. But a left-hander who writes their right hand, or vice versa, that would be considered a shinoi. That's unusual fashion, and that would not be an isur D'Oraita. Does not mean it's permitted, but it means that it's that it goes down to D'Rabbanan. Okay, now you'll see in the box underneath. It's brought to the Mishnah over the page. Writing is something very, very specific, where if you've ever tried to write with your weaker hand, it comes out, it doesn't really look like writing. It looks like it's something else. And therefore, that is considered a shinui. But for many melachot, many actions, if I do it with the other hand, right, if I'm cooking and I, hold the pot with the left hand or the right hand, hopefully it's still gonna come out the same. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, quoting the Chayei Adam, he says here, source number 11, Katav Chayei Adam l'kol melachot chutz mikotev chayav b'mimino b'mismol. All the other melachot, I don't consider using the other hand as shinui. Ach, beraglo, b'piv, u'marpeko, mashma sham, b'patur b'asur. Okay, if you're doing it with your mouth or with your feet or with your elbow or something else, that generally is going to be that's going to be the unusual way, and that's going to be considered a shin. Again, shinui still does not mean that it's permitted. There was a humorous video that came out a few years ago. Somebody showed me the other week, where it's one of these comedies with a bit of a skit where the guy gets up and he's on his way to shul and he walks downstairs and suddenly like the remote control for the TV like ends up in his pocket. He's like, trying to and he's trying to turn the TV off, and all he manages to do is raise the volume, and eventually it goes off, and it's in the pocket, the whole thing. But this is where the concept comes from. Sometimes you see people say things, do it with the back of your hand, or do it with your elbow, etc. That is a shin. We're going to have to see when a shin would be permitted, obviously with other factors as well. So another example, one of the melachot we know is carrying, even though it's called a melacha grua. Carrying is a lot of ink which has been spilled about that particular melacha. It's interesting that the beginning of Masechet Shabbat, the very first Mishnah, the first section of the Gemara deals with the melacha of carrying. You would have expected, start off with something. Why carrying of all things? There are reasons why that is. But they also, what's the normal way that one carries? Carries one's hands, or maybe one carries one's back, or different objects have different ways of carrying. But says the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, source number 12, Hamotzi masui al shul. You carry something on your head, but one is going to be exempt. That is not the normal. Again, it's patur aval asur midrabanan, because that's not the normal way of carrying. The im timtzei lomar and shehutza losimke. You'll say, there are people who do so. People in a certain place called Hutzah, this is how they would carry on their heads. There are places in the world where people carry things, carry things on their heads still today. You can see that. Nonetheless, it says, this is not considered, this is a principle we have, it's not a subjective rule, it's an objective rule. Most people don't carry that way, and therefore that is considered a shin.
Why is that different than writing with your left hand than your righty? It's not normal. So the person writes with the left hand and your righty is a shinui. So and vice versa. So here you've got a case where somebody does carry on their head. It should be. No, so I think you would say that the normal way of writing is writing with one's hand. Or we could define it like this: people write with a dominant hand. Okay, some people, and it's not such a. It's a minority, but it's not such an unusual thing. We know that it's the normal way of people that some people's dominant hand is the right, most people's dominant hand is the right, but some people's is the left. The normal way of writing is that one uses one's dominant hand. But the normal way of carrying is that one uses one's hand and not one's head. That's a specific, call it an anomaly or specific change. That's a certain group of people that most people in the world don't. That's not the way that it's done. That's I think what we would say. And it's interesting to note. Would there be those who would say, if this becomes something very, very common, is there a point where it changes? You have a look at footnote number 7, where it says, according to Marach Ozaram ben Ishchai, it's not considered halachic shinui to perform melacha in an unusual manner when the result is the same. On the other hand, the Eglei Tal maintains that such a deviation from the usual method is still considered shinui, even if the result is identical. Okay, we'll talk about that now a little bit more. So one of the questions which comes up when we are going to, as I said, shinui. This is also one of the misconceptions that people have. Something is forbidden. Deal with a shinui. You can't just do anything with a shin. Right? There are certain situations. One of the situations is
when we get to pikuach nefesh, let's just start off by saying the following: that when there is a situation of pikuach nefesh, and if any deviation is going to slow you down, you're going to start thinking, how do I do it? Do I do it this way? Do I do it that way? It's going to cause danger or might cause danger. So you don't think about it. There's no shinoi. There's no anything. You do what you have to do in the normal way to save a life, whatever violation that entails. However, there are situations where it is pikuach nefesh, or it's going to lead to a situation of pikuach nefesh, but you have time, but it's not going to slow you down. The person's able to think, I'll pick up the phone with this hand or that hand, or whatever it is. So it is brought in the Shulchan Aruch, source number 13. He says, when we need to violate Shabbat for a chole sheyesh bo sakana. First of all, we have halacha that it's better to perform the melacha for pikuach nefesh. It should be a Jew who's doing it. We don't want to outsource. We don't say, even though it's pikuach nefesh, find a non-Jew to do it, find a child to do it. No, the idea is that we don't want people to come to hesitate when it's necessary to perform pikuach nefesh. But having said that, says the Rama, Yeshurim, and again, the pertinent words here are belo dichui or belo ichu. It's not going to slow you down. It's not going to cause any postponement. If you deal with a shinoi, so then I'll say ayadei shinoi. I'll give an example. Let's say a woman's about to give birth. Okay, so that's a situation of pikuach nefesh. Again, it's not necessarily immediate. You know, sometimes if the ambulance comes, you need to do CPR, whatever it is, it's immediate. There's no question. We don't stop thinking about shinoi. But in that case, you need to drive to the hospital. It could still be a few hours, but it's clear that you need to go, and you have time to think about how to get into the car and how to drive or whatever. So in that case, says the Rama, then if you can do with the shinoi, so that's better. That's better. Says the Mishnah Berurah, we have a principle that whatever the more permissible way, even though we have the license to break Shabbat, the more that we can do it in a permissible way, the better, where it's possible. Like the say if it's going to take you a few more seconds, I think, but again, there's not going to be any
consequence.
Sorry?
Consequence, yeah.
Any consequences, so that's okay. But the reason why we say this is because when you do it with a shinoi, then you're transgressing a Isur D'Rabbanan rather than a Isur D'Oraita. Okay? And the Shemirat Shabbat Gilchata, to summarize, number 15, he says, right, so when we are breaking Shabbat, we're allowed to. Again, the less, the fewer prohibited acts that we can perform, the better. So long as it's not going to influence the person. So much as we can limit the severity of the prohibition. So he gives examples. He says you could do a shinoi, or sometimes another is what's called when it's an action which one person could do by themselves. So if two people do it together, that would also lower it down to the Rabbanan rather than a Doraita. Again, I cannot emphasize this enough. And all that we're talking about is only where it's not going to cause that to cause that negative outcome. I had a conversation once with a doctor. I think I mentioned it before, and he told me that he was he was a young from doctor many years ago when he had just qualified. And nowadays there's a lot more halachic literature. There's a lot more discussion. There's a lot more guidance, and it's more well known. But then it was difficult. And he said that on Shabbat, when he was working, he used to get so stressed. He used to get such anxiety about doing things. Do this with the shinoi, do that with the shinoi, do that. What he said to me was he almost killed somebody. I don't know exactly what the case was or how it happened. I don't know if he was just exaggerating or that was actually the case. But he said, and after that, so he just stopped listening to the rabbis in terms of what he should do on Shabbat. That's obviously not the conclusion. I'm not telling you to stop listening to the rabbi. But the point is, there may be, it may well be, one of the difficulties you have in situations like in hospitals with medical personnel, you have in the army as well. Okay, here's another case. Soldiers that are sitting in Gaza in the northern border and wherever they are, Okay, on Shabbat, you do whatever you need to do. You don't start, you're in a pilut mivtza'it, you're not going to start asking questions about, should we shoot the terrorists with a shinoi or not? No, obviously not. That's ridiculous. You do whatever needs to be done. However, when you're not in an emergency, life-threatening situation, you're just on guard duty or whatever it is in a place that's not particularly dangerous, so you don't have a license to wipe away Shabbat. That's the idea. That if we just say, why do we want to minimize the Isur? Because otherwise, you hear from many soldiers, you hear from doctors, when they're on shift on Shabbat, it's not Shabbat, it's just like a weekday. That's the situation that we want to avoid when it's not, when it's not a life-threatening situation. But as I was saying, if he's a doctor and he's on call, and it's going to cause him tremendous anxiety all the time, think about what it is, and it's going to reduce the quality of the treatment that he would give. So then he would do it in the normal way. That's how it would be. But where it's not going to cause that, so then we try and minimize the Isur. And of course, we understand we're just giving general principles here. All of these things need to be established, need to be known on a case-by-case basis. Depends on the individuals involved, depends on the situation, depends on the level of the threat, the danger, etc. But the klal remains, the overarching principle, safek b'koach nefesh. It's not just when it's definite b'koach nefesh, even when it's safek b'koach nefesh, that for that we're allowed to doche. So there are some interesting guidelines which are here, which were printed, taking us back about 8 months or so, at the beginning of the war. So we had all sorts of questions. Again, I'm not talking here about the soldiers necessarily. I'm talking about people like us. Remember the first few Shabbatot after Simchat Torah. So there are all sorts of questions. Can we leave the TV on for Shabbat? Can we carry phones around on Shabbat? Many people here in this Beit Knesset asked me, can they come to shul with a cell phone? So for those people who were on Miluim, or who could get called up at any moment, so there's no question you have to have your phone on, you have to answer it if the army calls, etc. I think it's safe to say that most of the people in this Beit Knesset are not going to get called up for Miluim anytime soon. But so then the question was, is there really a need, or is there a point? So what we did for the first few Shabbatot was that we felt that it was important, we'll see now in the guidelines, we felt it was important that it should be somebody with access to a phone. So we had somebody upstairs, we had somebody downstairs, we had the emergency phone here as well. But again, that is because it's safek b'koach nefesh. In case chas v'chalila something happens, we need to evacuate, we need to call somebody. Okay, it should be there. But that's a situation where we're going to do things with a shinoi as well, because there's no immediate direct threat. So have a look at source number 17, page 257. These are from the instructions of the chief rabbinate, which were published at that time, and it says here, "B'kol beit knesset yesh la'aniach me'erev Shabbat machshir telefon patuach." Again, we all understand these things can change, and it's very dynamic, and one needs to understand what the situation is. But in that situation, they said in every shul you should have a phone that is on, that is available. In order to alert the emergency services. You could keep in there. Then you could keep a phone in one's pocket. Right? Somebody who has a weapon, and that we would say now as well, would carry that on Shabbat, even if they don't normally around there. Rav Shmuel Eliyahu was the chief rabbi of Tzfat. He has a little bit of a more detailed guideline over here. So you see source number 18. So he writes, if one needed to leave one's phone on to receive alerts, etc., that was okay. And he says you should charge it beforehand. And yeah, here the concept of shinoi comes on. He says, for whatever reason it happened that the phone was not charged on Shabbat. And it's now, so you have the phone that's left on, because if it's not on, you're not going to hear the alert, so you're not going to be able to go to the shelter. But now the phone is running out of battery, so it needs to be charged. So there he says, in such a situation, he says one would have been allowed to charge the phone with a shinoi. How do you charge it with a shinoi? You use your elbow to plug it into the cord, I don't know, whatever it is. Right, and that obviously is talking about for people where there is a security need for it. That's probably also relying on the fact that charging the phone is probably an Isur D'Rabbanan in the first place, and then we're minimizing the Isur. Over the page, he says, again, all of this is specific to that particular situation. This is not just a blanket leniency. But he says there's somebody who needed to go from one place to another. There they could keep the phone in their pocket. לכן אפילו על ספק פיקוח נפש יוצאים ונוסעים ברכב, משתמשים בפלאפון בצורה רגילה, אפילו לא בשינוי. There, where there was a case of danger, even if there's a doubt, but there might be a danger, go in the car, you take your phone, there's no shinoi necessary, because that's going towards a life-saving activity. And he says, last paragraph, יש דעה שמשתמשים בשינויים זה בוודאות, לא גורם טיפה עיכוב. He says, there is an opinion, as we've seen, that if it's not going to cause, and again, his language, לא גורם טיפה עיכוב, even if it doesn't cause a drop, even if it doesn't cause a small delay that you could do with a shinoi, אבל אם יש ספק עם גורם עיכוב, even if there's a doubt that it might cause you to delay, הרי שיצא שכרו בהפסדו, then what have you done? So then there's no need for a shinoi, and then you could do it as necessary. Okay, so those are some of the applications of the concept of shinoi. As I said, today we're just going through the language, going through different principles. The next principle that we come to, I guess this will be the last one that we do for today, is what's called a melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. So what does that mean? That literally means a melacha that is not needed for itself, for its own action. Okay? We have two concepts. We have a nomit kaven and psik reisha, which we'll discuss next time, and melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Very, very similar ideas. It's not so clear always exactly where we draw the line between one and the other, but it's important to know because the outcome is going to be very different. We have two famous machlokot between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon throughout Masechet Shabbat. One relates to davar she'eino mitkaven, something that you don't intend to do, and one relates to melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. What is the difference? What is the melacha she'ena tzricha legufa? So the idea here is melacha she'ena tzricha legufa is where I'm performing a melacha, performing a certain action. I intend to perform the action. I know I'm performing the action. I'm aware of what I'm doing. I'm conscious of what I'm doing, and I intend to do it. But I'm not performing it for the sake of the melacha itself. So the example that's given over here is carrying. Carrying is a melacha. Why do I carry? Because I've got the object with me. Say I've got a kiddush cup. I've got the kiddush cup in the street, and I want to bring the kiddush cup into my house, right? Or I want to take the kiddush cup with me wherever I'm going. The Gemara talks about a corpse, and you have a met inside the body, inside the house on Shabbat. Different question in terms of a met being muktzeh, but there's an eitzah how to get around that. But if one carries it outside of the house because it's starting to smell, because it's starting to whatever it is, so there we see it says chayav, and Rabbi Shimon poter. Rabbi Shimon says you are exempt. Why? Because this is a melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. I'm not carrying the body out because I want to carry it from place A to place B. I want to remove it from where it is. The way I remove it from where it is I'm doing it by carrying it into the public domain. But that's not essentially what I'm trying to do. So Rashi here gives us a definition. He says, Rabbi Shimon poter afilu mitchalem davei melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Kol melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Right? Any melacha which I'm performing, not because I intend to perform this particular melacha, but because I want to remove the impediment or I want to move something away from it. That is therefore considered melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. Debirtzono lo ba'alo v'lo haya tzarich la. Right? In other words, if I could have done it, I could have achieved the same outcome without performing the melacha. I'm very happy to do that. And therefore, that is not melechet machshevet, according to Rabbi Shimon. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's still going to be chayav. But according to Rabbi Shimon, not. Rabbi Shimon poter. As we've already learned, the word poter does not mean mutar. Right? This is going to be in contradistinction to a nomit kaven, where we say it actually is mutar. Here it's just patur, which is patur aval asur. Tosfot gives a slightly different definition of melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. He relates it to that which was performed in the Mishkan. And he says that if it's not done in the same way that was done in the Mishkan, therefore it's going to be a melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. The Rambam, just say very quickly, maybe we'll see a little bit more next week, but the Rambam holds like Rabbi Yehuda in this case. Rambam holds that melacha she'ena tzricha legufa is chayav. The Shulchan Aruch disagrees, and most of the poskim disagree. He quotes the Rambam because he's such a significant posek and on this matter. So the Shulchan Aruch does quote the Rambam, which says chayav, but according to most of the other poskim, melacha she'ena tzricha legufa is going to be patur. Okay, the other classic case relating to melacha she'ena tzricha legufa is the melacha of extinguishing, the melacha of kiboy. I'll just leave you with this food for thought. That when I extinguish a fire, why does a person extinguish a fire? Essentially, you want to get rid of you want to take it away. You don't want to have the fire here anymore. I don't have any interest in the particular act of extinguishing. And therefore, I could ask that whenever I perform the melacha of kibui, it's a melacha she'ena tzricha legufa. That's the what seems to be. Okay, so the poskim discuss that. In fact, the Mishnah discusses that, but that is the other classic example. So we'll stop there for today. We'll pick it up next week. Melacha she'ena tzricha legufa will lead us into davar she'eno mitkaven and psik reisha, which is probably the most common, the two most common words that are said in terms of the Chot Shabbat. Psik reisha, psik reisha, psik reisha. We'll discuss that next week, exactly what that is, mitasek, and a few other things. And if we have time, we may or may not, but we'll get on to either next week or the week after. We'll get on to the Melacha of Bishul. I nearly forgot. Next week there will not be a shir. Next week I'm away. I'm going to be in Chutz La'aretz just for a few days. So no shir next week, but Bezrat Hashem in 2 weeks' time.